Mud islands. A twist of sand capped with low, wind-torn vegetation. This atoll-shaped island lies about 50 miles south of Melbourne, just within Port Phillip Heads. Geologically, it's quite recent, laid down on the only outcrop of dune stone that sticks up above the waters of the shallow bay. The first thing one wants to do on an island, of course, is explore it. One's drawn to this fact that you're circumscribed by the water and you can encompass the whole thing with your own legs. That pale scrub is the dominant plant growth on the island. It's a coastal saltbush amongst which the gulls nest and the terns, stretching away to the sea in the background behind me. And the low weed is a glasswater, strange, slimy pig-face growth that is found all over the low parts of the island. See the channels there scoured deeply where the water runs out from the central lagoon, which is stretching away into the middle of the island there. This lagoon is beloved of swans, but is mainly the haunt of the waders, the greenshanks, the curlew sandpipers, the stints, that all come down from the Arctic to spend their summer here. South of the lagoon, the dunes lift up to the high part of the island, and behind them, the gullies drop down onto the flat ocean beach. To the navigator, the island is a hazard lying in the channel. But to naturalists like me, it's a haunt and a haven to be returned to many, many times.
When you first observe the natural world, you may well gain the impression that it is made up of the most incredible variety of forms. Closer acquaintance will show that there are but few of these, repeated in endless variety. Take this oyster shell, for example, here on the beach. It's the most incredible map of Mud Island. Here, at one end, is the outline of the land, rising up out of the shallow water. The first sandbanks hollow down here into the lagoon. If you follow it round, you'll see the rising land here where the sand dunes are up at one end. And they drop down again onto the ocean beach at the back. Running out in this direction are the sandbars, laid down by a million tides, mottled and textured with the weed patterns that lie just beneath the surface of the water.
Textures. Textures of what? A great rock dune? This is actually only a small shell. And here the texture of a feather, lost and buried in the sand. And this, a great tree trunk, or is it a small twig? But these shells are no bigger than my small fingernail. Gradually all these seashells are smashed and battered and torn by the elements, destined to suffer the change back to sand. The dark hollows gleam like dead eyes and wink the tears of the departed sea. The abrasive sand cuts and runs. The enormous pincers looking like a cockatoo bill, the grotesque discarded armour of a crab. A mud whelp, hollowed and scarified. The dead seashells bear a strange resemblance to the dead bones of birds. Here in this great albatross bill, the hollows are echoed. This is probably a black-browed albatross. They come in through the heads quite frequently and sometimes come to grief, get washed up. And this great horny carapace is actually so light that you can hardly feel it in your hand. It's a beautiful thing, modelled and shaped. But it's not all death. This Caspian tern is perhaps the liveliest and most striking bird on the whole island. They're the largest tern in the world, nearly 2 feet long. Black-capped, red-billed. Their raucous cries ring out over the beach. You have to stalk them quite carefully to get close enough to see enough to sketch them and bring home notes for paintings. It's almost a fierce bird. It frightens one sometimes, diving and screaming at you. Here's a pair on the nest. The one on the left is sitting on the egg and perhaps the male bird guarding on the right. See that dagger bill for taking the fish out of the shallow water. Like all terns, their Caspians are sea fishing birds. See the discrepancy in the eggs, the strange light egg and a dark egg in the same nest. It's quite a common thing amongst seabirds. This we're seeing now as a displacement activity. The bird doesn't know whether to flee or to come back to its nest, and it displaces its nervous energy into a mock feeding, bowing action.
The latest in Mud Island mussel shell nose guards. Oh, that hurt. It's not as bad as the sunburnt nose. There are gentler, more decorative terns than the great Caspian.
The crested tern, smaller and a rather prettier bird than the Caspian, is the commonest of this group around our shores, except in the far north. Throughout the year, they may be seen on any sort of beach, a rocky outcrop beach or a mud flat or sand. And then every spring they come to such places as Mud Island and gather in these great, noisy, tumultuous colonies to raise their young. Beautiful flyers, terns. See that tail working in the air there, levering and working on the air in those updrafts off the hot sand. You see the wings go down there. There's a piece of display here. The intruding bird has dropped in, and the bird holding the territory drops its wings in a buffet display. And we'll see that the arriving bird has to leave. The territorial strength of the first bird is too much for it. As the young birds are hatched, they're gathered into these creches. You'll see all sorts of sizes and shapes of the young crested terns. The territorial instinct is subdued considerably in the parents at this stage, and they gather together for protection from the gulls. The gulls are great predators on these small birds. Here's a tiny one, only 2 or 3 days old, cosseted by its parents. You see the various stages of growth there. They're disturbed by my appearance in the bush, I think, but they're not terrified. They just scatter off in a fairly controlled way. They're not frequently visited, and they don't seem to have learned to fear man, which is a very pleasant thing to experience when you get out on the island. Here's a little chap tangled in the weed. He's only 2 or 3 days old. You see the speckles on his head and back, the same speckles for camouflage as we find on the eggs. That crest thrown up on the adult in the agitation of its protectiveness. You walk amongst them calmly and quietly. They soon settle to one's presence and come quite flatteringly close, actually. There's some stages of growth. The black-capped ones are considerably older. They're perhaps a month or so old. And the little fluffy ones are anything from a few hours to a couple of days. The gulls stand in line there, and the poor baby terns run the gauntlet. The gulls are quite marked predators of the nestlings. If they wander too far from the flock, they get snapped out very smartly. Off we go. Almost looks as though he's licking his chops, doesn't he? One of the interesting reactions to intrusion that the fledgling birds have is to take to the water, either the open sea or, as in this case, the lake. And they swim out in a tight flotilla, huddling together. The parent birds hover anxiously overhead because even out here they'd be an easy prey to the voracious silver gulls. They battle along through the tiny waves. This interesting discrepancy there in plumage, rather similar to the difference between the eggs. More of that tail twisting, beautiful flight. There they go, battling into shore. Quite an excursion for them. The last fluffy youngster staggers up behind the rest. This is the camp on the beach. Usually when I'm out in the bush, I try to make some semblance of civilization around me and gather a little driftwood. Here's my workbench that I've made from planks cast up on the ocean shore and carted back over the dunes. That's a mud whelk that I'm painting. It's a large shellfish that is quite common in the shallow water all around the island. As you can see, it's almost as big as the birds. The small wading birds are red-capped dotterels. A resident bird, unlike the stints and sandpipers that come down from the Arctic, this bird nests along our shores. Bark and birds go rather well together, don't they? The male bird on the left with his strongly marked facial stripe, and the more sombre female on the right. See that relatively long bill for probing into the mud, typical wader bill, fairly long legs for skittering through the shallows. This galvanic little chap is a similar bird. It's the red-necked stint. This is a migrant from the Arctic. Extraordinarily quick movements, aren't they? Of course, they have to be as quick as the insects they're picking up out of the mud. It's hard to imagine such a mite flying all that way, 10,000 miles, twice a year, driven by its instincts. Of course, very many die, fall and perish in the natural order of things.
This is the white-faced storm petrel, Australia's only petrel, in the sense that it's the only one that breeds here. And you can relate it to a number of other species by a number of characteristics. The primary one being this tubular nostril, which is a very strange device, and relates it to such extraordinarily different birds as the albatross and the mutton bird, or the shearwaters, to give them their more correct name. It's surely the most beautiful of all the group. It's an absolutely lovely dove grey colour on the back, with darker wings and a very pretty little face, very delicate creature indeed. It's rather amazing that such a small and fragile-looking bird spends its whole life at sea, away out in the wildest Antarctic oceans and our Bass Strait and the Tasman Sea, except for the couple of months that it comes here to lay its egg in these burrows all around me. The dark patch around the eye has probably got something to do with its nocturnal habits too. It's rather similar to the dark facial patch of an owl, and quite a lot of night birds have this. The long wings, very, very long indeed for such a small bird, but very necessary for this peregrination that it undertakes every year. It has webbed feet, strange fleshy yellow webs between the black toes, and practically no claws, which is rather a weird thing, but it probably comes from all the digging that they do. They probably wear them down. There's a very tiny bit of claw poking out at the end of the foot. This breeding station here on Mud Island is one of the few that there are in Australia. It's quite a rare bird, actually, although large numbers of them appear to nest here and in Western Australia. But apart from this haunt and the few islands off the coast of the southwestern parts of Australia, these are the only breeding haunts that anybody knows about. So they probably are the only populations in the world. That beautiful spread of wing really is quite enormous for a bird that probably doesn't weigh more than about 2 ounces. It's having a bit of a struggle. They're quite tame once you settle them down. They don't have much to do with human beings. And consequently, he'll sit quite quietly in your hand. I don't think he's nervous. Probably a bit astonished to be out in the daylight. They mostly don't come out until about dusk. Sometimes on a grey day, they might come out at about 5 o'clock, but usually darkness has fallen before they shuffle out of their burrows. They can't actually stand. Although they've got these great long and rather strong-looking legs, they can't stand on them. They shuffle along on this long tarsus bone and have to find a prominence on which to get before they can take off. Because of these enormous wings and their squatting position, they just can't spread their wings. They get tangled up with the weeds and the sand, and they all shuffle to a little prominence and lift into the air about dusk in clouds together. Well, I think he's had enough of being out in the daylight. I'll pop him back in his burrow and he'll shuffle in.
All through the blue saltbush nest the silver gulls. Always something to say. Here I am hunting under this screaming cloud of silver wings for their eggs and young birds. The ground is littered with nesting spots. This incredible cacophony goes on all day and actually most of the night as well. Screaming and caterwailing. Quite an incredible sound, but you gradually become used to it. It's the background sound of the island. Here's a typical nest, mottled dark eggs against the textured background. And here's an interesting example of the discrepancy in colour again, a very pale and a very dark one. In 3 or 4 weeks, the young birds hatch out. Sorry little fellows, aren't they? Wet and exhausted from their struggle of breaking through the shell. You can see on the end of the bill there's that tooth-like nail of breaking their way through the shell. A few hours later, they're strong and on their feet. A little unsteady, but quite able to go off and hide in the bushes. The interesting thing is if they wander from their territory, they get killed by the other gulls. And here's a pair just being brave enough to venture out into the sunlight. As you can see, they're quite unsteady, but already very pugnacious. Now here comes the parent bird on the left, bowing its head to regurgitate, a strange sicking movement. It throws up pieces of half-digested krill and so forth, and the young birds hurriedly and hungrily peck it up off the ground. They're strongly territorial, these gulls, in spite of the apparent confusion to the human beholder. Stridently defending their boundaries. This chasing goes on all day. And here's a young bird begging. It's a fairly mature bird, as you can see, but it's still begging for food, importuning the poor old parent who's busy guarding the territories and has got no time for this sort of thing. Back it comes, running the gauntlet of its own young. Now see how that pursued bird, when it gets onto its own territory, can turn and throw up its neck and chase off the other bird, deriving a sort of psychological strength from being on its own ground. That poor parent. It's a wonder they're not worn out at the end of the day. And now they're importuning young out there, begging for food from its parent. At this stage, it almost certainly wouldn't be fed.
That darker bird amongst the gulls out on the beach is a pied oyster catcher. They're certainly the smartest birds here on the beach. They're rather superb black and white tops and little red trousers. The fascinating thing about this bird is the bill structure. It has the most unusual bill. It's compressed vertically at the business end, and they use this as a chisel. Quite literally, they go along the beach and finding rocks with small limpets and so forth, they slide this chisel bill in under the limpet, they take it by surprise, sneak up and flick it over like that, and it's the only way to get a limpet off. If you've ever tried, it's a very difficult thing to do.
Here's the pair down on the edge, and here's one of them just bringing in something to prise open with that chisel bill that we've been looking at. And off he goes. Delightful birds, glossy black plumage and sealing wax bill and legs twinkling in the sun. They became quite tame, rapidly becoming used to our presence in their nesting area. A bit of scuffling goes on, but basically they're non-territorial on the edge of the sea. And here's one walking right through our camp. Isn't that lovely? Quite flattering to have them come so close. Now here they are, quite peaceful, down on the edge. No squabbling. But once up on the territorial area, there they go, chasing off this third bird with their necks down and bills gaping open in threat. Here's their nest. Lovely warm brown speckled eggs in the sand. Broken in outline for camouflage in the shells and twigs. Death plays a large part in the island story. It seems strange at first that so much should die, but one comes to realize that 90% or even more of these birds that are born are destined to suffer this change from flesh to sand. If all the population lived, it would be a very short time before the island was so densely populated it would be uninhabitable. Here's a tableau, a small, fluffy, day-old chick, and the sad remains of a 2 or 3 month old bird lying beside a more mature one, all dead from natural causes in this natural order of things. I've been hunting along the estuary here and looking at some of the smaller life in the water. It's full of krill and other planktonic life at the moment, which is being washed out from the central lagoon in there. But this is another rather larger creature, quite a ferocious crab. He's a superb-looking thing, isn't he? And he, too, is playing his part. These feed on carrion, and as the birds die and get washed into the lake in the centre, it comes down the estuary here, and he does his job in cleaning it up. Some of the larger birds will feed on a crab of this size, and he in turn feeds on them. So I'll put him back now to continue his little part in this cycle of life on an island without men.